Well, the tributes, of course, to Sidney Poitier have been very heartfelt. They not only show what type of actor he was, but what type of man he was.
And you can see joining us now with a deeper look at his lasting legacy is Anita Dashell-Sparks, a Burns Distinguished Professor for the USC School for Dramatic Arts. And we have veteran entertainment journalist Jeanne. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. A pleasure to talk about Sidney Poitier.
Yeah, you bet. And I understand Anita is there, I assume, right? I have a first question. Is it just Jeanne?
She's here, I think.
Yes.
Okay, we don't see you, Anita, but I can hear you. So how was Poitier's career influenced and encouraged? How has he done that for the next generation of actors and artists and just people in general, in your opinion?
I think that one of the things that really distinguished his work and the legacy and makes it so profound and rich is that he brought humanity. He brought a depth of humanity, a depth of complexity and integrity to every role he embodied. Whether it was a person who was a doctor, a lawyer, if it was somebody who was of a worker, a lower socioeconomic class, across profession, across different ways of contributing to society. He portrayed characters that ran the gamut, which was really kind of unique in that capacity. And he took the opportunity with every role to embody, to really not only find the humanity and the integrity, but the dignity of what it meant to be Black, what it meant to be a Black man, and what it meant to be an American. And to really utilize his body, his presence, his representation. He used every opportunity he had on stage or on screen to represent our different notions and our understandings of African-American identity, African-American Black masculinity on stage and on screen, and to really challenge the racialized stereotypes that so many performers of his time and of his generation, even after him, have had to try to navigate that terrain. And he refused in every role he played to reinforce and reify negative racial stereotypes. And I just think that is such a wonderful model of excellence, a wonderful model of artistry, and a wonderful model of that kind of commitment to the power of what we do as artists, as storytellers, to really use that time and that space and that opportunity to not only have something to say, but to really be accountable and responsible through which the way it is said and it is presented in our different media formats.
And you said it so well. I mean, he took on so much responsibility, social responsibility. Jeanne, you've covered some of the biggest names in Hollywood. What is one of your favorite memories, moments with Sidney Poitier?
Well, my favorite moment with Sidney Poitier is he also understood, in addition to all the things that she just described, that he could make money. And that was the idea of, oh, black movies, no one's going to go see them. In 1967, he was the most popular actor in America. He did 3 films: To Sir with Love. He did To Sir with Love. He did Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, and In the Heat of the Night. And you just saw in that clip the slap when he slaps the white man back. And that is one of the, all through the years, that is one of the scenes that was the most shocking and the most representative, because he had said to me, if I didn't slap him back, I wouldn't be showing my pride in who I was, how pivotal I was to the plot of this movie. And other people would say, oh, I don't want to be a role model. He understood what he represented to so many people, and he took it with pride. He understood it, and he lived up to it. He also was extremely grateful to some little people who helped him so much. You know, he was brought up in the Bahamas early on. He went to Nassau when he was 10, and that was a big city for him. And he went to a high school that a school that didn't even have a high school, but he had a teacher he always remembered named Mr. Fox. And he said you'd sit at your desk on Cat Island and you'd look out at the ocean and you think, what's beyond that horizon? And Mr. Fox taught me imagination. He taught me how to daydream. And that dreaming and that imagination is what made me an actor and made me go after things that I shouldn't have dared to dream of.
You know, my mother introduced me to Sidney Poitier in the movie Lilies of the Field. She absolutely loved that movie. And of course, he won an Oscar, he was knighted, but he also was a family man. He had 6 daughters. So Anita, can you talk a little bit about some of the behind the scenes things about Sidney Poitier that we may have not known of before?
Well, it's interesting because I'm reminded of a reflection when I first moved from New York to Los Angeles, and had a chance to meet him once at an event with the Nate Holden Performing Arts Center here in Los Angeles, and the artistic director of that theater, Ren T. Brown, was a longtime friend of Sidney Poitier, and I was able to meet him in one of those moments, in one of those events, and I just remember such a quiet humility. A quiet humility, just the presence and the aura that he carried into any room and into any space. And the generosity in which he saw you, in which he greeted, the warmth in which he greeted and respected everyone that he sort of met, when he met me and others around. There was a quiet humility and a generosity that I think permeated just the way that he lived his life, with such a great respect and a value for family and for the things and the people that mattered the most. And that's what we really saw translated.
Yeah, I think
that kind of personal connection.
I think we could probably talk about Sidney Poitier for the rest of the hour, for sure, ladies.
Sure.
Thank you so much for your time and your expertise and your insight on this day. Thank you.